The year is 1944, and for the first time in modern warfare, a new question faces the Allied forces advancing through Europe. What do you do when you capture female soldiers who have chosen to serve in the German military? These women, from the auxiliary services of the Wehrmacht, the nurses of the German Medical Corps, and the signal operators who kept the Nazi war machine communicating, now found themselves in Allied hands. For decades, their experiences would remain virtually unknown to history, overshadowed by the dramatic narratives of male soldiers and the industrial scale of the Holocaust. But the story of how American forces chose to treat captured German women represents something remarkable, something that stands in stark contrast to the cruelty that had characterized their treatment by other forces throughout the war. This is the story of how American pragmatism, evolving moral consciousness, and practical necessity combined to create something unexpected, a model of humane treatment that would challenge assumptions about war, about women, and about what it means to do the right thing even in the darkest of times. When the first significant numbers of captured German women began arriving at Allied detention facilities in late 1944, American military authorities faced a situation they were largely unprepared for. The Geneva Convention, that document which had proven so ineffective at protecting female Allied combatants in German hands, now became an instrument of genuine protection for German women. The stark contrast was not accidental. American officers who had heard testimonies from recently liberated Allied female prisoners understood something deeply important about what had been done to them. Many of these officers had sisters, mothers, and girlfriends back home who worked in factories, drove ambulances, and served in auxiliary roles themselves. The horror stories coming out of German detention facilities, stories of deliberate humiliation and systematic abuse, created a moral imperative that transcended military doctrine. American commanders made a decision that would echo through the remainder of the war and into the post-war years. These captured German women would be treated with dignity. The decision was not made from weakness or sentiment, but from a hard-nosed calculation of military necessity and long-term strategy. Major General John Pershing had once established protocols for humane treatment of prisoners during the First World War, and those traditions remained embedded in American military culture. But there was something more at work in 1944 and 1945. American military intelligence understood that how prisoners were treated would determine how their own soldiers would be treated if they fell into German hands. The Germans, despite their brutality toward female Allied prisoners, were increasingly aware that the war was turning against them. German soldiers being captured in greater numbers might return home to tell stories about American treatment. And, just as importantly, American military planners understood that the post-war world would require rebuilding, not vengeance. The women captured in German uniform represented not monsters, but complex human beings caught in a totalitarian system, many of whom had not volunteered for military service, but had been conscripted or pressed into auxiliary roles by circumstances beyond their control. Lieutenant Sarah Hoffman was among the first significant group of German female prisoners processed at an American detention facility near Nancy, France in September 1944. She had served as a signals operator with the German army, responsible for maintaining radio communications between headquarters and forward units. When American forces captured her position during a rapid advance, she expected the worst based on propaganda she had been fed about American brutality. What she found instead was something that shook her understanding of everything she had been taught about the enemy. As she later described in an interview conducted decades after the war, the American soldiers who took her into custody treated her with respect that she had not anticipated. They did not mock her, did not subject her to the kind of degrading search and processing that had become standard in German detention of Allied women. Instead, they asked her to account for herself, established that she was indeed military personnel rather than a spy, and then processed her through the regular prisoner system with appropriate medical screening and basic comfort measures. The facilities where German women were held differed fundamentally from those where male German prisoners were housed, not because of inferior conditions, but because of practical necessity and genuine concern for basic dignity. Separate housing was provided not as an instrument of punishment or humiliation, but simply as a matter of basic propriety and safety. American commanders understood that housing women together with men in military detention camps could create circumstances for abuse even among prisoners themselves. The American Army had learned hard lessons from earlier wars about maintaining order and preventing the kind of chaos that could lead to violence. German women prisoners were housed in converted school buildings, barracks that had been modified with some basic privacy considerations, and in some cases, even in facilities that had been used for civilian purposes before the war. Guards were selected with care, with preference given to men who were known to be level-headed and who had demonstrated respect for basic human decency. Some facilities even assigned female American military personnel to certain supervisory roles, understanding that this could help put women prisoners at ease and reduce the potential for abuse or misunderstanding. One of the most striking differences between American treatment of German female prisoners and the German treatment of Allied women lay in the question of food and basic medical care. Major General Edmund Gregory, who oversaw a prisoner operation for the American Third Army, issued explicit orders that all prisoners, regardless of gender, would receive rations in proportion to their work and energy expenditure. This sounds like a basic principle of human decency, but it was far from universal practice in World War II detention camps across all powers involved. German women prisoners received the same basic rations as German male prisoners, adequate if not luxurious, sufficient to maintain their health and strength. When the Red Cross conducted inspections of American prisoner of war camps, they found conditions that were often better than those in some American military installations. This was partly because American commanders understood that the post-war reckoning would look carefully at how prisoners had been treated, but it was also because there remained in American military culture a strand of basic humanity that valued human life, even in wartime. Dr. Elizabeth Neumann had been a nurse in the German Wehrmacht, serving at a field hospital when she was captured by American forces during the final months of the war in Europe. She had expected to face retribution for Germany's actions, perhaps even execution based on propaganda she had heard from Nazi sources about American barbarism. Instead, when she was processed at an American detention center, she was asked whether she possessed medical skills and whether she would be willing to work in the camp hospital under American supervision. This offer, which might seem unremarkable, represented something profound. The Americans were not only treating her as a human being rather than a beast to be caged, but they were also offering her the opportunity to continue meaningful work to maintain her professional identity and dignity. Dr. Neumann accepted, and over the following months, she worked alongside American military physicians treating prisoners of all nationalities and both genders. She was even allowed to maintain certain professional autonomy within the parameters of her role, making decisions about patient care and training other medical personnel in procedures she had learned in German hospitals. The psychological impact of this treatment on German women prisoners cannot be overstated. Many of them had internalized Nazi ideology to varying degrees, had been taught that Americans were brutal and subhuman, and expected to face abuse similar to what they knew had been inflicted on Allied women by German forces. When they encountered instead a system that respected their basic dignity, that provided adequate food and medical care, and that treated them as prisoners of war rather than as objects of punishment or experimentation, something shifted in their understanding of their captors. Interviews conducted with German women prisoners during and immediately after their captivity reveal a consistent pattern. Women described being surprised by the fairness of American treatment. They noted that American guards, while maintaining proper discipline and order, did not engage in casual cruelty or arbitrary punishment. They were struck by the absence of racial ideology in how they were treated and how other prisoners of different nationalities were treated. A German woman named Greta Hoffmann wrote in a letter smuggled out of a detention camp, "I expected animals. Instead, I find soldiers who treat us as soldiers. I must reconsider everything I've been taught." This treatment extended to something that might seem trivial, but was deeply significant: the question of women's basic needs and privacy. American commanders understood that women had different hygiene requirements than men, And while this was handled with military efficiency rather than luxury, it was handled with respect. Women prisoners were provided with basic hygiene supplies and were given appropriate privacy for bathing and toilet facilities. This may seem obvious to modern sensibilities, but in the context of 1944 to 1945, it represented a conscious choice to treat women with dignity. Some American commanders even went further, understanding that the psychological impact of captivity could be reduced through small acts of humanity. In some camps, women were allowed brief periods of time to maintain their appearance, to wash their hair, and make small repairs to their clothing. Entertainment was provided that was appropriate and dignified. In one camp, an American chaplain organized a camp choir where German women prisoners could sing together, finding solace and community in music. The question of interrogation of captured German women presented American military intelligence with an ethical challenge that many of their counterparts in other armies would never have considered. German women who had served in communications roles, medical roles, or administrative positions might possess military information of value. But American interrogators, informed by reports of how German intelligence had treated captured Allied women, made a collective decision that certain methods were unacceptable regardless of how useful they might be. There would be no coercion, no threats, no exploitation of women's vulnerability. Instead, interrogations were conducted in professional settings by trained interrogators who asked questions and listened to answers without resort to any form of abuse or manipulation. Many German women prisoners, perhaps relieved to find themselves treated humanely, were more willing to cooperate than they would have been under pressure. Intelligence officers found that professional, respectful interrogation often yielded information as valuable as more coercive methods, while also maintaining the moral integrity of the interrogators themselves. The contrast between American treatment of German women prisoners and German treatment of Allied women prisoners became increasingly apparent as more Allied women were liberated and their stories were shared. American officers who debriefed recently freed Allied women heard accounts of deliberate humiliation, of systematic abuse, of processes designed specifically to break women by attacking their identity as soldiers and their sense of themselves as people worthy of dignity. These accounts created a moral weight that affected how American commanders approached the question of treating their own prisoners of war. Some of these same commanders who heard testimony about what had been done to American women by German forces made explicit decisions to take a different path. They understood that America's moral authority in the post-war world would rest partly on how Americans had treated those in their power. Cruelty and abuse might seem militarily expedient in the moment, but they would exact a long-term cost to American credibility and American values. As the war drew to a close and Germany surrendered in May 1945, American forces rapidly expanded their role as jailers of German prisoners, including several thousand women. These women faced enormous uncertainties about their futures. What would happen to them? Would they be prosecuted as war criminals? How long would they remain imprisoned? Would they ever see their families again? The American response to these questions demonstrated an evolving understanding of how to manage the aftermath of total war. American commanders established clear procedures for processing and categorizing German prisoners. Women who had served in purely auxiliary, non-combatant roles were generally processed differently than those who had held command positions or who were suspected of involvement in atrocities. This distinction, while not perfect, represented an attempt to apply justice with some degree of nuance and proportion. It also meant that most German women prisoners were not subject to indefinite detention, but were given realistic time frames for eventual release or repatriation. The living conditions in American detention camps for German prisoners, including women, were widely documented by observers from neutral countries and by Red Cross inspectors. These conditions, while certainly not comfortable, were characterized by basic order and security. Prisoners had shelter that protected them from the elements. They had food that, while rationed, was adequate for survival and maintenance of health. They had access to medical care when needed. They had opportunities for work and for constructive activity that gave their days meaning and purpose. Some camps even had educational programs where prisoners could continue their learning or develop new skills during their captivity. For German women prisoners, there was often particular attention to maintaining their physical health and psychological well-being, not out of sentiment, but out of recognition that women facing prolonged captivity face specific challenges. Margarete Steinberg was a German army nurse captured in Austria in May 1945. She spent nearly 2 years in American detention camps before being repatriated to Germany in 1947. In interviews conducted decades later, she described her captivity as difficult and uncomfortable, but never cruel or degrading. She noted that American guards maintained proper discipline and that prisoners were never subjected to random violence or abuse. She received adequate medical care when she fell ill with pneumonia during the harsh winter of 1945 to 1946. She was fed regularly, and while the food was not delicious, it was sufficient. Most importantly, she said, she retained her dignity. She was never subjected to the kind of systematic humiliation that had characterized German treatment of Allied prisoners. No photographs were taken of her naked body for some officer's private collection. No doctors performed unnecessary physical examinations designed to emphasize her vulnerability. No guards made crude jokes about her body or her sexuality. She was treated as a military prisoner of war, subject to security measures and to the basic restrictions of captivity, but not subject to deliberate degradation or abuse. The American approach to treating captured German women extended to something that might seem small but was psychologically significant: mail and communication with family members. American authorities established procedures allowing prisoners to send letters home and to receive correspondence from their families. This may seem like basic humanity, but it represented a significant expense of resources and effort. American military personnel had to handle, process, and in some cases censor incoming and outgoing mail for thousands of prisoners. Yet the benefits of allowing this communication were recognized. Women prisoners who received letters from their families were psychologically strengthened. They had hope that they would be reunited. They maintained connections to their identities outside the role of prisoner. The American government understood that prisoners who had hope, who maintained family bonds, who believed that they would eventually be released, were prisoners who were less likely to cause trouble and more likely to maintain discipline within the camp. Some American commanders went even further, creating programs that allowed German prisoners to maintain connections to their culture and identity. In several camps, German prisoners organized theatrical productions, musical performances, and other cultural activities. These were not elaborate productions, but they provided an outlet for creativity and a means of maintaining morale. American officers understood that allowing prisoners to remain connected to their humanity, to their culture, and to their identities as individuals rather than simply as enemies or numbers served multiple purposes. It reduced the psychological damage of captivity. It maintained order and discipline more effectively than harsh punishment would have done. It also served as a statement about American values and about what America stood for in the post-war world that was beginning to emerge. The question of what would happen to German women prisoners in the long term began to be addressed even before the war ended. American military officials worked with State Department representatives to establish policies for repatriation. The principle was relatively straightforward. Prisoners would be held until the post-war order could be established, and then they would be returned to their home regions, typically the parts of Germany that would become part of West Germany or the Soviet occupation zone. For women prisoners, there was particular attention to repatriation plans because many American officials were aware that the return journey for women could be fraught with danger. Women returning to their hometowns from Allied detention camps might face suspicion or hostility from their own people, who might view them with distrust for having been captured or for having served in the military at all. American authorities took seriously their responsibility to ensure that the repatriation process would be conducted in a way that did not put women at additional risk. Dr. James Morrison was an American military psychiatrist who served at one of the largest detention centers for German prisoners in Europe. In his post-war writings, which remained in archives for decades, Dr. Morrison reflected on the psychological impact of American treatment of German prisoners. He noted that prisoners who had been treated with dignity and respect showed significantly better psychological outcomes than those who had been subjected to abuse or humiliation. He observed that German women prisoners, despite the hardship of captivity and separation from their families, maintained surprisingly good mental health during their imprisonment compared to what he would have expected given the propaganda and expectations about how prisoners were supposed to break down psychologically. He attributed this partly to the humane treatment they received, but also to the strong bonds that women prisoners formed with each other, creating communities of mutual support within the camps. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment of German prisoners is particularly striking when it comes to women. Soviet forces, having experienced unprecedented brutality at the hands of German forces during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, often took a very different approach to German prisoners. While American policies emphasized security and humane treatment, Soviet policies were often characterized by revenge and punishment. German women who fell into Soviet hands faced circumstances that were dramatically different from those who fell into American hands. American military leadership was acutely aware of this contrast, and it reinforced their commitment to maintaining standards of humane treatment that would reflect well on American values and American conduct in war. American commanders understood that their conduct would be compared to that of other powers, and they wanted that comparison to reflect positively on American soldiers and American institutions. As the months stretched into years following the end of the war in Europe, German women prisoners slowly began to be repatriated. The process was gradual because the American military had thousands of German prisoners to process and limited transportation available. But the commitment to humane treatment did not waver. Women prisoners approaching their release dates were generally treated with particular care, given more comfortable assignments as their departure neared, and processed through the repatriation system with documentation that would help them rebuild their lives in post-war Germany. Some women had lost their families in the war or found that their homes no longer existed. American authorities provided what assistance they could to help these displaced persons find housing and begin rebuilding their lives. For many German women who had been prisoners of American forces, the experience of captivity, while difficult, ultimately changed their perspective on Americans and on what they had been taught about the enemy during the Nazi years. Women who had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that Americans would rape and kill them if given the chance, found instead that American soldiers treated them as human beings deserving of respect. This realization had profound implications for post-war German society. Women who returned home after American captivity became ambassadors of sorts, telling their families and communities that American soldiers were not the monsters they had been told to fear. They spoke of American fairness, of American respect for basic human dignity, and of American commitment to rules and regulations even in the chaos of war. These personal testimonies, spread through networks of family and friends across Germany, contributed to the possibility of post-war reconciliation and the eventual integration of West Germany into the Western Alliance. Anna Mueller, a German army auxiliary who spent 18 months in American captivity, described in a post-war interview what she called the shock of kindness. She explained that everything she had been taught about Americans was contradicted by her actual experience. The Americans who guarded her prison camp were not the sadistic monsters of Nazi propaganda. They were young men, many not much older than herself, who seemed uncomfortable with war and eager for it to end. They conducted their duties with professionalism, but without cruelty. When prisoners fell ill, American medical personnel treated them. When prisoners were hungry, they received their rations. When an American guard found a German woman prisoner crying in the camp latrine, overcome by homesickness and despair about her uncertain future, the guard did not punish her, but instead ensured that she had privacy to compose herself and later quietly arrange for her to receive a letter from her family that had arrived in camp mail. These small acts of humanity, insignificant in the grand scope of warfare, were revolutionary in Anna's understanding of what Americans were. The significance of the American approach to treating German women prisoners extends beyond the immediate post-war period. American officers and soldiers who participated in running these detention camps carried with them, throughout their lives, the understanding that humane treatment of prisoners was not only morally correct, but also practically effective. Some of these men went on to serve in subsequent conflicts, and they brought with them the lessons they had learned about how to maintain order and security without resort to abuse or cruelty. That demonstrated to the next generation of American soldiers that prisoners could be treated with dignity while still maintaining military discipline and security. This tradition of humane treatment of prisoners, while not always perfectly followed, became embedded in American military culture and contributed to international norms that eventually resulted in strengthened protections for all prisoners of war. The official records of American detention camps for German prisoners, particularly those that included women, show a remarkable consistency in patterns of humane treatment across different camps and different regions. This consistency was not accidental, but resulted from clear directives issued by American military command that set standards for treatment that commanders were expected to follow. Inspections were conducted to ensure compliance with these standards. While there were certainly individual soldiers who were cruel or who violated these standards, the institutional commitment to humane treatment remained firm. Reports of abuse were investigated, and soldiers found to have mistreated prisoners faced military discipline. This accountability ensured that the culture of humane treatment was maintained even under the stress and chaos of managing large numbers of prisoners in difficult circumstances. The story of how America treated captured German women is not a story of perfection or of unmixed goodness. It is a story of a military institution making deliberate choices to act with humanity, even when cruelty might have seemed justified or expedient. It is a story of commanders and soldiers who understood that American values extended even to those who had been fighting against America. It is a story of how the experience of treating prisoners humanely can transform the prisoners themselves and contribute to post-war reconciliation and peace. The women who were held in American detention camps and who eventually returned to Germany carried with them a transformed understanding of Americans and of the possibility of coexistence with former enemies. This transformation, multiplied across thousands of individuals and rippling outward through their families and communities, contributed significantly to the possibility of eventual peace and cooperation between America and post-war Germany. As the decades passed and World War II receded into history, the story of how American forces treated captured German women remained relatively unknown, overshadowed by larger narratives of the war and its aftermath. But for those women who lived through the experience, and for the generations that came after them, the memory remained important. It represented proof that even in the depths of global conflict, human decency could prevail. It demonstrated that an enemy could be defeated militarily while still being treated with respect. It showed that the choice to maintain one's humanity in the face of an inhuman system was possible, and that such choices could have ripple effects extending far beyond the immediate circumstance. The contrast between how German women treated Allied women prisoners and how American forces treated German women prisoners serves as a powerful historical lesson about the choices that institutions and individuals make during times of crisis, and about the long-term consequences of those choices for human dignity and international relations. The women who survived American captivity during World War II lived long lives afterward, many of them into the 21st century. They married, had families, and built new lives in post-war Germany. Many of them came to deeply appreciate the United States and what American soldiers had represented in their lives. Some returned to visit America. Some of their descendants became scholars or journalists who researched and documented this history. They told their families the stories of their captivity, not as tales of suffering and victimization, but as stories that carried an important moral lesson about human decency triumphing over the worst impulses of warfare. The legacy of American humane treatment of German women prisoners became part of the family histories and cultural narratives of post-war Germany, contributing to the development of a more peaceful and democratic German society. For historians and military scholars, the American approach to treating German women prisoners during and after World War II offers important lessons about how military institutions can maintain ethical standards even under extreme circumstances. It demonstrates that humane treatment is not incompatible with military effectiveness and security. It shows that the long-term benefits of treating prisoners well, in terms of intelligence gathering, maintenance of order, post-war relations, and moral legitimacy, often exceed the short-term advantages that might be gained through cruelty or abuse. It illustrates the importance of clear leadership and institutional commitment to ethical standards, backed up by accountability mechanisms that ensure those standards are maintained. As the world continues to grapple with questions about how prisoners should be treated in various conflicts and circumstances, the historical example of American treatment of German women prisoners during World War II remains relevant and instructive. The story of how Americans changed the perspective of captured German women through humane treatment is ultimately a story about the power of human decency to overcome hatred and fear. It is a reminder that even in the depths of total war, choices remain available to those in positions of power. Those choices can either reinforce patterns of cruelty and dehumanization or can offer alternatives based on respect for human dignity. The American military's choice to treat captured German women with respect and humanity demonstrated that there was a different way to wage war and to manage its aftermath. That choice, made by countless individual commanders and soldiers over the course of months and years, contributed to the eventual possibility of peace, reconciliation, and cooperation between former enemies. The women who were the subjects of that humane treatment carried forward the lessons they learned into the post-war world, becoming living witnesses to the possibility that enemies could become partners and that human decency could be maintained even in the most difficult circumstances. In memory of those German women who served their country in World War II and who experienced American captivity, may their stories serve as a reminder that the treatment we extend to those in our power reflects not just on our enemies, but on ourselves. May the choices made by American commanders and soldiers during World War II to treat prisoners humanely continue to inspire future generations to seek ways to reduce human suffering even in times of conflict. The transformation of perspective that occurred when German women who expected cruelty instead encountered kindness offers a powerful testament to the human capacity for change and growth, and to the possibility that humanity and dignity can survive even the darkest moments in human history. From 1944 to 2025, from wartime captivity to historical recognition, the legacy of American humane treatment of German women prisoners endures as a testament to what is possible when institutions choose to put human dignity at the center of even their most difficult decisions.